Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be talking to Robert Harmon today, data architect at Firebolt. Today, we'll cover some lessons of me asking some questions, basically. Would you mind giving a quick introduction of yourself, who you are, and what's your
Sure,
origin story?
sure. My name's Robert Harmon. As mentioned, I'm one of the architects at Firebolt currently. Prior to coming to Firebolt, I was working at Blueprint in the consulting space, building out data architecture for very, very large Fortune N companies. Before that, I spent, well over a decade in the ad tech space, working with massive data warehouses. And that's really where I cut my chops. Before then, believe it or not, I was in the tech support space. Working with large publishers like Microsoft and CA and et cetera, managing tech support teams. And that's really what drew me into the data world is pulling data for managing tech support of all things.
Nice. Well, really happy to be talking to you today. As we know and have heard, there's a lot of chatter about 2023 being the year where data needs to be efficient. There's all of the efficiencies. We don't have the money anymore. The free Snowflake credits are gone. And we're going to have to figure out how to actually prove return on investment on data projects and data teams. So maybe we start there. Like, what do you see as the things that need to happen this year, in your opinion?
Boy, that's a big question. And, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it definitely echoes, and we're there again. Um, I'm seeing a lot of similar things in the industry today as we saw in 2002 and then 2008. 2008 was a little easier because we just experienced 2002. That generation had already been through one of these large, the dot-com bust was a large IT shakeup. So we kind of had it in our minds. We were built differently because of that. That was the first one. It was a surprise. But after the first one, you start building strategies to at least guard yourself against the next one, or when the next one happens, that you're in a good place. Now, the 2008 world, as you know, had nothing to do with IT directly. It was largely driven by the housing market. But for me, that had huge ripple effects because at that time, as I mentioned, I was working in the ad tech world. Ad tech is, it's very reactive to market changes. So if the stock market takes a 5% hit, the ad tech world's going to take a 50% hit. Or if the stock market goes up 5%, the ad tech market's going to go up. It's highly reactive. So things that happen in the normal world happen bigger and faster in that world. And what we found in that rotation was that sticking to the fundamentals works. It's simple things. We don't grow our team any bigger than it has to be. We have to be efficient with headcount. Part of that is your hiring process. You need to find the right people. If we go back to Brooks, again, everything's fundamentals. If we go back to Brooks, he was pretty clear that an excellent contributor will deliver an order of magnitude more output than an average contributor. So we look for those excellent contributors. They don't double, they go huge. And then the second thing is how we manage our data systems. In that environment, we were very, very strict on who and how the operational systems were managed, because obviously we're a big ad tech supplier, so we've got billions of transactions per second. The operational system has to be tightly controlled for two reasons. First off, it has to be manageable. All the data coming out of it, we need to know what to do with it in the BI space. And secondly, it's just a lot of data. You're going to blow things up if you don't get it right. In that world, I was managing the data team, and I had my feet in both swimming pools effectively. I had a tight grip on the operational system and a tight grip on the BI analytics system. So that gave us, some freedom and some efficiencies, because who am I going to have a data contract with? It's me. I'm on both sides. So I know how these things are supposed to work. Now, that is a challenge when we're working with separate teams. So that interface becomes very, very important. And rather than going down the rabbit hole of democratizing the workload and and coming up with, well, I mentioned data contracts, and I have no problem with data contracts. It's a great idea. We decided that instead of going down that road, we'd again go back to the classics and build a really robust operational data store.
So maybe that's actually a good segue to the two big themes you've already sort of touched upon: the sticking to the fundamentals and the data systems, BI and ops. So if we start with the fundamentals, like what are the data fundamentals that we've all seemingly forgotten?
In the operational side, things are going fairly well. You know, people working with products like SQL Server, managing transactions, not a lot has changed in that world. It's going pretty smoothly. Where we start to run into problems is after that. So historically, we would have a transactional system that we would feed into an operational data store, or a number of transactional systems that we'd feed into an operational data store. And that gave us predictability in the system. If somebody changes a transactional system in a way that it will no longer appropriately feed the operational data store, schema violation, etc., it pops, you get an error, you solve the problem, and move on. It takes seconds. Well, not seconds, but minutes. Today, we don't do that. We take our data from our transactional or operational systems, we dump it in a data lake where there's zero constraint. We hope and pray that it's right. And then we consume that into our downstream systems, and we've all seen it. There's a change to the operational system. This cascades down into the data lake. Nobody's there to catch it because there's no constraint, no schema. All heck breaks loose. And then you've got your data teams pointing fingers at each other. The real problem is it takes time, and that time is the killer.
So, do you think that in the past, and especially when we had on-premise warehouses, like you actually had to go and manually fix an issue manually, and now
oftentimes,
so there's like
yes.
And now that there's automated ways to create fallbacks, or not even sort of like crash the entire system when there's errors. So I guess it's easier to let it slide. Plus, then the past 10 years of just having the free money to dump everything anywhere.
Exactly. And that, so we run into two issues there. First off, we're dealing with more data because we threw more money at operational systems. So of course there's more data. Things are more chaotic, more complicated. But whether there's automated tools or not, if the data generated does not meet the specification for what I need to ingest, I'm in trouble. And that's one point where we start to fall down. The second issue we run into is, cloud data warehouses have been an amazing thing. Obviously, I'm a proponent. I work for a cloud data warehouse vendor. They really are great things. But in parallel with bringing on cloud data warehouse platforms in our industry, and I'm not saying, that this was a cause or that there's a causal relationship here. It's just, it seems there's a correlation that when we brought cloud data warehouse platforms online back in the day with the initial Redshift offering and then a Snowflake in that period, which was what, 2010 and 2011, I can't remember. Certain behavior started to change in data warehouse architecture. We started dropping off constructs like an operational data store. We started removing constraints, which I thought was an interesting behavior at the time. How do I know my data is correct if I don't have RI? Now, the platform may not.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Sorry, just to drill on. Does that have to do something with the Hadoop era, with the emergence of like document style Mongo, like NoSQL, because they're like where you have less constraints? Or
well, I even when Redshift was originally an offering, it didn't have declarative referential integrity. It wasn't part of the product. I get that. Well, when SQL Server 4.1 came out way back in the day, it didn't either. So we wrote code that would constrain things for us, either through triggers or through after checks, etc. So just because RI isn't part of the native product doesn't mean that you can just abandon it, in my eyes. It still needs done. Now, how you do that may change from platform to platform. We just quit doing it. So whether that's RI or whether that's, you know, extended constraints on types, I want my phone numbers to be in the format number hyphen social security number formats, etc. We just abandon all that. Well, this will have a direct effect on analytic quality. There's no way around it. If I can't constrain my data, then I'm going to run into problems downstream, and those logical problems, those logical mistakes create huge manpower costs later, because now my data analysts have to deal with it. Now my end users have to deal with it, things of that nature. The other thing that I think we did that has been an absolute nightmare for me ever since it happened is some of us took on dimensional modeling as a great idea. This is controversial, I know, because there's a whole industry that says it's a great idea. Well, it's a start, but it's not the goal of proper database design. Proper database design, we go back to, you know, CJ Date, an introduction to database systems. We need to start working on absolute, you know, solid normalization, and sometimes that means a grain far smaller than what dimensional modeling can do for us. But people oftentimes will just build out a dimensional model, say it's tight enough, and move on. The problem with that is now you're starting to create update anomalies all over your data system, because you've got, you know, your employee is sourced from a fact table, and that employee is repeated over time, rather than having a separate employee relation. And if you need him temporalized, to temporalize that relation and then surrogate the temporal key back to the fact table, you get the idea. This creates
in fact, if you don't mind, so dimensional modeling, this has to do with Kimball, correct?
Yeah.
So if you could dumb it down for me, like what when you talk about dimensional modeling, how does that work? Like what?
Sure. Oftentimes, what you'll see in a normal dimensional model is the core will be a fact table. This is where we're recording activities, sales, for instance. Off of that, we're going to have a number of attributes. And in following Kimball methodology, what we try and do is create those attributes as a star pattern, if you will, so that from the fact, you'll have a direct line to an attribute. So customer buys a product. So we have a sale, we've got one entity for product, we've got another entity for customer. All well and good. And we'll maintain these three objects through consistently. Now, the problem becomes to maintain that star-like structure, we can't have circular references. We can't have structures that are more complicated, because it will break down those those dimension structures and complicate things in ways that the Kimball method simply doesn't support. So oftentimes we'll see a customer dimension that has, say, location information for that customer. And then it will also have like a sales representative for that customer in the customer table. The reason for that is if I separate out that sales representative as its own entity, now I've got a link from sale to customer to sales representative. Of course, the sales rep has a link to location. The customer has a link to a location. You see that star structure, that nice, neat structure starts to break down, and it becomes more complicated. And that's ideal in my eyes, but it doesn't fit, you know, the strict Kimball method.
So what's the limit? Like up until what point should you keep a star schema, Kimball dimension schema?
I'm not a fan of dimensional modeling at all, so I'm the wrong person to ask. I build models. I build relational models. If I've got a customer, I'm going to break that customer down into its attributes. Well, it turns out maybe this customer isn't a customer. Maybe it's just a business contract because I've got customers and then I've got third parties that I'm managing and I need to generalize it. And all of that fun noise of normalization comes in. It's more complicated to build up front, but normalized structures get back to that previous issue. A normalized structure brings in constraint. And developers generally screw up if you don't give them bumpers.
Yeah, kind of like what's it called? You play that game where you bowling. It's like bowling with guardrails. Like
exactly. That's kind of the idea here, is to make because the data is going to go wrong on you. It's always going to go wrong on you. When you're building data systems, you just assume it's going to error. And those constraints are what will allow you to deal with that error. It's very similar to, you go to a banking website, you punch in your, a payment to someone. And if you put the dollar amount as Jeff, it's going to blow up and say, no, Jeff is not a dollar amount. Yeah. Well, the same thing should be true in a data warehouse. When I go to consume customers, if this customer does not fit the format of a customer, it's not a customer. The transaction should fail. It should raise its hand, say, hey, Rob, something went wrong here. I don't know, toss it, rerun it.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, who should be deciding the constraints, or who?
That's the fun bit. So that negotiation in my head happens in the operational data store space, not the data warehouse space itself. In the data warehouse space, data warehouse architects and data engineers, etc., should just be free to run. That space is theirs. Let them go. In the operational world, much the same is true. The transactional data architect or database administrator should have absolute freedom there. Where we meet is the operational data store. And there, in my operational data store, I may have a representation of a customer from an operational system. And the two teams are going to have to negotiate what that customer looks like in the operational data store.
Yeah. And now we're getting into the territory of data modeling and the semantics of how, like, definitions of like what is a customer and who.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Everything starts in the operational data store. And the reason for that is when data comes out of that operational system and into the BI system, it goes through that gate, and that gate has schema, and that schema is going to defend itself.
Yeah.
So if something blows up on the ingestion into the ODS, that should alert the operational data teams, you've done something. On the way out, I'm free to go in the BI space because everything is there as I expect. Now, if I've got a user in the BI and data warehouse space that says, I need this new attribute, it's not in the ODS, I need to go back to the operational team, we'll negotiate that new attribute in the ODS, and off we go. Now, I am also a big proponent of one ODS for as many operational systems as you've got. So we don't cut this up into 7 different ODSs. It's one. That way everything is co-located. This gives me two advantages. First off, makes life real easy for your data warehouse guys. All your stuff is in one bucket. The other thing is it gives business users and business analysts a place where they can go do quick querying when they don't need temporal state and integration. If they want to see the now, it's right there, go. And it won't beat up on the operational system, and it won't slow down a data warehouse architect trying to build a new thing. But from here, they can gain insights that they can use to inform the data warehouse team what's next. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Follow-up question. So you got the data engineers, the operational database managers, or the managers, the administrators, and then they come in together, they start negotiating, deciding how this works. But at the same time, in the space, we always talk about how there's a massive disjoint between the business user and the data engineer, and the business concepts, all the way down to like the data engineering piece. So in this equation, like you mentioned that the business user comes in and queries, and they can do some quick analysis. But do they, or should they have influence over this negotiation, so to say?
Absolutely. I don't do anything in a warehouse if it doesn't drive business value. There's no point. and this probably gets back to the core of where we started here, where
Yeah.
it's a rough year. If I'm not building business value, I ain't gonna make it. So that's the other side, and honestly, this is where it gets a little rough being in the data warehouse architecture space. Is we have to wear a lot of hats. The reality is I have to go talk to the end users a lot. Whether those end users are line of business folks in finance or marketing or et cetera, or the CEO himself. And sometimes we have disagreements, and that's fine. But part of that is I have to have some grounding in business process analysis, which seems somewhat out of scope for a lot of practitioners today, but it is very, very valuable.
So elaborate on that business process analysis, as in like understanding what drives value for the business.
Absolutely. The pieces that we, in some cases we'll even change. I've even driven change in business units, not data changes, but process changes, because the data can't capture what it needs to from their existing process because their existing process isn't effective. Now, I do cheat a bit on this. I fall back to a methodology that started in America in the 1960s called Malcolm Baldrige. Malcolm Baldrige was a business process savant. But really at the core there, he sets up some standards. And believe it or not, in America, we've actually made his standard law. We give out prizes every year federally for Malcolm Baldrige high performance businesses that follow that standard. And it's really quite simple. At the end of the day, for every process that can touch a customer, and there's a lot of them in a business, I need to know the on-time, backlog, volume, rate, and quality of that process. So these are my 5 goals. This is what I'm chasing as a data architect on everything. If I can get those 5 things figured out in my data warehouse, we're golden. So if it's silly things. If we look at, say, DHL delivering packages, each package has an expected on-time arrival, right? A number of them are not going to arrive on time. It's a big system. A certain percentage are not going to arrive on time. So my on time for this delivery guy might be 98% for the month. Now, next month, he may have had a bad month, and that'll drop to, say, 90%. We don't really care the 98 or the 90%. Neither of these are good or bad. What is important to me is the variation. So this week, is Joe the delivery driver within a half standard deviation of his norm for on time? If so, I don't need to look at him. He's good. He's normal. Is he within a quarter standard deviation of his team's distribution? If so, not a problem. We're good. Now, if we walk this through from on time to backlog, how many packages does he have yet to deliver? That's his backlog. He's got 27 packages today that he still needs to deliver tomorrow. And this is another number that'll fluctuate. We'll attack it the same way. We'll watch that fluctuation. We watch that. Is it normal? So we do this for on-time, backlog, volume, rate, and quality. How many complaints are we getting? The packages are busted up. That's a quality metric. You get the idea. And we can adapt this to any business process. But then at the end of the day, what I'm looking for is a system that can find those times or those instances where Joe the delivery driver breaks normal on one of these metrics. And these are just 5 metrics, but Joe the delivery driver may have 5 different customer related processes. So now I've got 25 metrics. But you get the idea. As these metrics come into the system, really what I'm looking for is abnormalities in the metrics. And if we can build an abnormality detection system on the other side of the data warehouse, watching for all of these little crooked things, and I've got my business processes down, and my ODS is well negotiated, and my operational guys are off doing what they do, at this point, I can improve your company. You have no choice but to succeed here. The numbers won't let you fail.
So all of this sounds like it sounds great. It's very defined. It makes sense. but at the same time, to me, it sounds like something that would be exclusively available to larger organizations like the DHLs of the world. Then you get to like, what if you're a lot earlier, what's smaller? Like,
right.
do
So
these
how
things?
how do you build this out? Yeah, because you're right. This isn't going to
How do you
happen overnight.
start?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's honestly, it's a question I still get asked quite often is, when exactly do I need to bring in a data architect? I think that's a very good question. So I've got my new startup. I'm delivering a product. You know, I've developed customer fit. We know that customers like it. So I've got an operational data system, and maybe I do a replica of that database for quick reporting. Great, no problems here. And the reason there's no problems here is because it's small and simple. I have a product. I have a team of maybe 100 people. We're all going in the same direction.
Yeah.
At some point, I'm going to want to bring in my Salesforce data and mix it up with my operational data. This is going to increase complexity. And that's where it's time to, you know, start at least communicating with a data architect. You don't have to hire one. You can rent one at any consulting company in America. They're great guys. But at least have an hour phone call and say, hey, where am I at?
Yeah.
What can I do to improve? How do I get to that next level? And there's nothing wrong with having a replica reporting database for a while. If that's all you need, go for it. But as the problems increase, you will find that you need to start building out that decision support infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the process really, I don't think, has changed or shouldn't have changed over the past 20 years, though, as mentioned earlier, we've missed some things and now we're in trouble.
Now we're coming back. No, that makes sense, and it especially resonates like from the world I come from, like the product market fit just hit and scale up startups where once you get to that fit, you start buying tools, you start hiring go-to-market tools. All of a sudden, like it's just the product database isn't enough. You have to merge it with some billing stuff from Stripe, then some CRM stuff from Salesforce, and it's all a mess. And
then of course none of the entities line up. I've got a customer that exists in all three of these systems, but I can't line up the IDs because they're all different, and you can't match them by name because people I'm Michael in one and Mike in the other. So then you bring in a third group here on top of operational data group and the data warehouse group. Now I need an identity management group. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
But when do you do that? When do you do this? This is a call each business has to make on their own. I can't.
Yeah.
It's good to have someone nearby that's done it before and just, you know, ping them and say, this is where I am. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, like, at least from my experience, a lot of the time there's like this, once you get to the stage and you keep going in that stage for like even years without properly doing something about the data, like infrastructure, the data mess you already have, like, then it's like this major issue of convincing, let's say, your leadership, like, can we please do something about this? Like, here's the solution, here's the problem, we actually need to. And then pushback being like, yeah, we acknowledge this is a problem, but not now. We got other priorities. Like, there's always other more important priorities. So how do we convince people that like there's immediate value to be gained? Like, not just in the near future when we can do, you know, when we have quote unquote clean data after the 6-month project, but because you have to, like, it's imaginary value that you don't see it. So how do you convince leadership to say, like, okay, fine, let's put some money behind this?
Yeah, and that could be troublesome. And it's you know, to my defense, it's a bit of a vague question, so I'm going to come back with a vague answer.
Perfect.
I have found myself in leadership positions among data groups for many years. And I don't always agree with the leadership of the company. Sometimes we disagree very vehemently. I can think of a number of occasions where it got quite interesting because we're passionate about what we do. We should be. But that's a relationship issue, not so much a technical issue. Having that relationship with your direct leadership is important. You know, one of my managers over that period of time, after we left, he was such a good leader and we had such a good relationship that when I went on to consulting, I went back and hired him as my boss because we yell at each other well. That's really it. We yell at each other well. And like anything else, it's a negotiation. This is why I'm thinking we need to do this thing. Now, can I put dollars and cents on it? This will save you this much money. This will make you this much money. Can I put something on that makes sense? If I can't, I'm going to get shot down. There's no point in the argument. If I can come to leadership and say, hey, look, I want to put this fundamentals-based system in place where I've got an operational data store, I've got a properly temporally relational data warehouse, and I'm watching for those key metrics, and I've got, you know, that abnormality detection system in place. I can show you day by day how much I'm saving you, because all of those, or how much I'm making you, because the results of that are all going to be in that abnormality list. This team improved beyond a quarter standard deviation this month. Well, how did they do that? Well, Rob fired up and told them how to do their job. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do all your metrics all at once. Do one. Get your, go find a team that's struggling to control what they're doing. Help them out. Run them through that whole system, one metric, and start tracking those abnormalities. And don't tell the team you're tracking the abnormalities at first, because you want to see what happens if they're just doing their thing. Let it cook for a month. Come back to that team and say, hey, look, this thing is going to give you an email every time you go sideways. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just letting you know where you are. And if a number goes below expected, we need an explanation why it did that. If the number goes above expected, we need an explanation why it did that. That's all I need.
Yeah.
And that one thing, it may not improve that metric for the whole team dramatically, but it will bring it into control. The worst performer on that team is going to become controlled. The best performer on that team is going to start falling into that standard deviation. And the cool thing is, the manager of that team is going to have feedback on everything that works and doesn't work. So he can tell the top performers how not to do what the bottom performers are doing, and vice versa. And that team will succeed.
Yeah.
But one metric, it seems like a lot of steps, but one metric is doable.
One metric, one team. It's funny. Just like the other day, Nico came in running around with Bill Inman's book, and he's like, look, this is what we preach, that we need to go in and help one team with one metric at a time, because that's like MVP style value proving. And then he points to the book and he's like, this is our go-to-market strategy from Bill Inman in 1992. And we're like, okay, nothing is really new.
No, well, and that sounds somewhat depressing, because it's kind of like, my daughter is adorable. She's a total handful. She's about 16. And every so often she'd come home from work and say, okay, Dad, what's new in data today? I said, well, nothing. Nothing is new in data. Nothing has been new in data for 3,000 years. This is Plato writ large. It's like asking what's new in physics. Nothing moves. It's all the same. So why are so many people working on it? I don't know. Why, nothing has changed in residential architecture either, but we still need houses.
Oh man. Well, at least good thing there's a new tool for just about anything every year.
Yeah. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is a thing.
Yeah. Just going back to the discussion we were just having on one metric, one team, one metric, just prove some value. And saying, like, being able to say to leadership or whoever is the business stakeholder with the money in the pocket, I'm like, it's easy when you can look at the past and say, look, I improved these metrics by this much. Like, now give me money to do something. But
Right.
When you're just like, when you're trying to buy that first piece, like give me money
Yeah.
so I can improve a metric by just like the thumb in your mouth and go 10%. Like, how do you approach like when you don't yet have that benchmark?
That's I think a mixture of two things. Again,
Mm.
you know, there's the data costs. There's going to be costs, manpower costs, system costs, etc. That's going to happen on any project. It's inescapable. We can reduce that by some of the methods that I've already mentioned, constraint, etc., throughout the system. That'll reduce your data costs pretty dramatically. And I can't escape that. I can reduce it, but I can't make it go away. The second thing is, like I said, it's that marriage with business process management and analytics. If I can come to my CEO with a business mindset married to that data mindset and say, hey, look, we know that if we do these 4 things, that the business is going to improve. We have to do it. Because if we don't, we're running blind. And that next recession is going to kill us. And we're seeing that writ large. If we look around at the industry today, there's layoffs, there's companies taking hits. And a cursory review of these companies shows that they are not controlling their key customer related processes. If they were, they wouldn't be in this trouble.
So yeah, now I think there's a healthy wake up call. It's hope, like, wish it would have like, okay, I'm not trying to say wish it would have happened earlier as in the recession, but
No.
what I'm trying to say is, like, now that it is a wake up call. You have to be efficient now. You more than ever you need to do
Right.
things well with your data, but you can't even hire the data team necessarily. So for those that have now realized that shit, we need to get our ducks in order. Like,
Yeah.
and what like first steps is it talk to a data architect? Is it to define your business processes, your analysis? Like,
it depends on the individual business, certainly.
okay.
I'm an architect. You can't pin me down to absolutes. It's against the rules.
I can try.
It's worse than a car salesman sometimes. I get it. The key to all of this noise and the circus that is the data world in the IT world, the key I come back to is the same every time. Whether you're following Baldr's methodology or not, you absolutely need, without question, to put that customer's experiences first. And you need to manage those experiences. So everything you do, you know, I fall back to those same 5 metrics because they give me a looking glass into what the customer's experiencing. Everything you do has to center around that. And you have to control for that. And I don't mean control like an iron grip control. I mean, is this out of control? Can I, you know, what happened here? Is this predictable? Is it repeatable? Can I build these robust customer-centric systems that will produce customer value? If you can do that, the rest, how do you do that, is unimportant. From there on out, we're just trying to reduce costs because there's a million, as you and I both know, there's a million ways of blowing money in a data system that you don't have to blow.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we walk backwards from that, that's kind of why I pick some of these processes. Is I'm just reducing cash through the system, you know, by building a proper data warehouse, by building a proper operational data store. It reduces manpower, it reduces system spend. That's all great, but really my goal is the same every time. What does the customer want? Figure that out and keep it in control. The rest, I swear, the revenues will take care of themselves once you're there. It's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
We look at the Starbucks model as an example. They are absolutely brilliant at figuring out every customer interaction and whether the customer interaction was on time, backlog, whether the volume is there, the quality especially is there. They look at these things constantly. And because of that, there's one on every corner, sometimes 2.
They're that good. Hey. No, that's it. it's an interesting phrase, like customer experience, meaning be customer first, meaning as a data person, like closer you can get to where your customer is at and what they do, the better. They you have this a lot in sort of SaaS softwares where you sort of bring your engineers as close to the customer, because then the feedback loop again is so kind of like similar thoughts here. It's like, well, actually it's not even a novel idea, like it just makes sense. Like the more context you have, the better you can build for it.
Exactly. And obviously I'm in a SaaS environment myself, so I see these things every day as well with our customers. We're a data warehouse platform. How many queries were run today? Okay, how many errored? There's a quality metric right there for you. How many ran more than a second? How many didn't? These are my rates. So I can start seeing the things that customers care about in a data warehouse platform by looking at these underlying metrics. Now, of those, I just mentioned how many queries ran today, how many failed, what's my failure percentage. Of those that failed, how many failed because of end user syntax issues? Of those end user syntax issues, how many can I cover with better documentation? So you see, a metric isn't just a metric. If we look at the interrelation between, again, these 5 basic metrics, we can start to find real gems. So they become action real quick. So if my on time is great, but my backlog is screwy, there's something there I can take action on that may change the entire product or the entire company. So as these things interrelate, and they will interrelate, we can do things. But I can't do any of that until I've got, that whole architectural structure in place.
Oh, man. The space is always just very exciting. It's like, oh, full of possibilities.
Oh, yeah. It's just data. I've got like 5 tools. It's not like I've got a whole bucket full of tricks here. Yeah. But when you put them together in interesting ways, really cool stuff pops out.
So maybe that's a good way to close, to summarize today. It's like, what are your top 5 tools that you always use?
Always? My always tool, you got me. This is going to sound really silly, but it's true. Notepad++ with the poor man's SQL formatter installed, because I hate poorly formatted SQL. And as long as I'm always using the same tool for formatting my code, I don't end up with, irrational check-ins where it checked in because there was a new line break. So there's my first always tool. Beyond that, it depends on the platforms I'm playing with. I'm a big fan of writing SQL in really bad editors because I like text. I think textually, not visually. So that works for me. But what works for someone else probably doesn't. I am not a huge ETL or ELT tool fan. I expect, mainly because of the structures that I outlined earlier, I expect very light transformation as things go through the pipeline, with the exception of integration. Integration is always a pain. But with that expectation, of course, now I have to give a product plug.
Let's go.
If you go with light transformation, the problem then becomes query response time on the other end, because if I've got all this granular data that's highly relational, spread over tables everywhere, pulling that query together at query time becomes difficult. I expect better platforms at that level, and that's part of the reason I'm working at Firebolt, is to solve for that problem, where we've got cool things like aggregating indexes and join indexes and whatnot, where you can normalize your data and still get rapid response time. The beauty here is if you do have highly normalized data, you don't have to do a lot of transformation. Your pipelines get really short. And since, products like ours and others that are coming into our space are now 100% SQL native, ingest is simple. It's a query. That's it. So I like to simplify as much as possible. That's really the cornerstone of engineering. Any idiot can build a bridge if they've got enough dirt. Do it efficiently is the trick. And that's where we make our money.
I love the answers. I when I did say your 5 top tools, I think in my head I thought it said toolkit as in like the processes, but I'll
Oh,
take the note. I'll take the
oh,
note.
there it's
Notepad
there
plus.
it's Notepad++ is my favorite tool. From a design perspective, it's books. There are certain books that I think everyone in the data architecture realm should read. And if anybody's ever bumped into me on LinkedIn, they've probably seen this list repeatedly. An Introduction to Database Systems by C.J. Date. It's older, but it hasn't lost its value. This will give you the idea of the structures and the mentality behind building data systems, whether they're operational systems or data warehouses. It's fairly all-encompassing on the theory behind data systems. It has nothing to do with SQL. It's all theory. It's heady sometimes. It's really hard to read sometimes, but well worth it.
Yeah.
The second one, of course, the Mythical Man Month from Brooks. It's the Bible in the engineering space, period. You can't be an architect unless you know where an architect fits. Brooks does an excellent job of explaining how these different teams and individuals within these teams work, as well as how to cut inefficiencies based on team buildup, saving spend. The last one that I absolutely love is Death March from Ed Jordan, where Brooks tells us what to do, Jordan tells us what not to do in Death March. He wrote a great book. It outlines everything you can do wrong in an IT project. Well worth every minute. It's not long. And then, of course, just because I've been, reading his books and so close to him for so many years, anything by Bill Inman is absolute gold. The corporate information factory was life-changing for not just me, but the whole industry. The neat thing is, from those structures, which seem fairly old, you're in a good place even today. They apply to the latest, greatest toys out there. If you can get the mindset of those structures down, you're in a good place. And then, of course, the last one, anything by Malcolm Baldrige, of course, because I mentioned them on the business process side. So Malcolm Baldrige had a number of books. There's a number of books that, extend on his theories. There's also a group here in the US called COPC that does Baldrige-style certifications. So that process is awesome. If you've never done it before, it's absolutely heartbreaking, the certification process, because they won't give you the certification until you do everything I just said with every customer-facing process in your business. It's rough, but the process is solid. So those are, that's really the world I live in and the toys I play with from a theoretical world rather than the hard tools I play with.
That's awesome. I have certainly learned quite a few things, and I have quite a few open questions I need to start Googling on my way home.